everyone, and thank you for coming. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome to the Department of Italian Studies and the Casa Italiana Professor Armando Maggi, who is the Arthur and Joann Rasmussen Professor of Western Civilization in the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures at the University of Chicago. Professor Maggi is what we would, call a truly transhistorical scholar and an interdisciplinary scholar. He's written extensively on early modern European culture, especially demonology, emblemata, and philosophy. And among his books in that domain in particular are In the Company of Demons, Unnatural Beings, Love, and Identity, in the Italian, oh God, I have lost my place. What's the end of, in the Renaissance, right, yes. He's also author of a terrific and very, very well-received on Pierpaolo Pasolini called The Resurrection of the Body, Pierpaolo Pasolini from St. Paul to de Sade, which came out with the University of Chicago Press in 2009. Professor Maggi, his most recent essays include The Fairy Tale as Waste Product, Bachelard, Benjamin Agamben, and The Anamnesis of Childhood, as well as a terrific essay on Pasolini's What Are the Clouds, Velázquez, Shklovsky, and the Gaze of the Childhood, which will appear actually in a volume that I myself am editing. So I'm aware firsthand of the incredible range and erudition of Professor Maggi's work. But in addition to that, he's also just a wonderfully generous and kind colleague and beloved teacher. And his scholarship encompasses everything from modern intellectual history on magic to contemporary culture with a specific emphasis on phenomenological approach. And other recent essays include work on Tasso's poetic self-commentary, as well as the reception of Pasolini's documentary, The Walls of Sanaa, which I haven't read, which I really want to now, as well as essays on Ariosto's Orlando Furioso and Marino's Adone. So the amount of scholarship and teaching on everything from the Renaissance epic to the Baroque and Neo-Baroque to Pasolini that we might list from Professor Maggi's activity would take all evening. But I hope that small encapsulation does justice to the range and depth of his work. And so we're thrilled to have him here talking about the Paduan 9/11 Memorial and the Fosse ardeatine. So please join me in welcoming Professor Maggi.
I can undress now. Thank you for having me here. The topic of my talk tonight, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. The topic of my talk tonight is kind of different from the themes that Ara just so kindly mentioned, and you'll see. So, first of all, we'll talk about the memorial to the 9/11 memorial in Padua. So, walking on Via Giotto in Padua after visiting the Scrovegni Chapel, we may overlook what at first seems like a white monolith standing on the right side of the street in the area of the so-called Porte Cantarine. And this is really the experience that I had. I just left the Scrovegni Chapel, and walking down the street, I saw this building. Daniel Libeskind himself, the architect of this memorial, the 9/11 memorial, which is the topic of the first part of my talk, makes the connection between this monument and the Giotto paintings. It is worth recalling that Libeskind, the architect, was the master planner of the new One World Trade Center. In reality, however, quote, another architect transformed the original plans and Libeskind was cut almost entirely out of the process. Looking at the memorial from afar, like in this picture, for a moment we may be reminded of the mysterious black slab in Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, or we may simply dismiss it as an isolated facade of an abandoned modern building in jarring contrast to the medieval frescoes we just admired a few minutes before. But even after walking down the path marked on the left by a low zigzagging glass wall ending with the title Memoria e Luce, Memorial to September 11, 2001, Libeskind's work remains a puzzling and solitary structure. Inaugurated in 2005, it is composed of two large walls of satin-finished glass, which open like the pages of a book with the fragment of a steel girder, almost 6 meters long, stuck in the left leaf of the book. Let me state, just what is obvious. The significance of a memorial, I'm not going to say anything groundbreaking now, the significance of a memorial, first and foremost, lies in what the visitor first perceives, and only secondarily in the historical, technical, ideological facets behind it. That is the information, all the information we gather later from external sources such as guidebooks, internet sites, and so on, which may enlighten but also obscure our initial experience. More importantly, as Daniel Purdy rightly points out in an essay on Libeskind Jewish Memorial in Berlin, so the same architect also is responsible for the Jewish Museum in Berlin, quote, "The investment of labor makes the monument a central unifying point for society. Successful monuments require collective actions." This is a very important point. The collective making of a memorial's meaning is of a central relevance for my talk. Despite Libeskind's effort to justify the theoretical background behind the choice of the location, according to Libeskind, the architect, quote, this memorial is delicately balanced amidst the historic buildings of Padua, the bridge and the watercourse beneath. The whole project also includes a rediscovery of the whole city walls, creating what is at the same time a site of memory and an uplifting place of inspiration. Despite these uplifting, lofty words, this memorial, the Paduan memorial, lacks, in my view, any strong link to the rest of its environment. And the reasons mentioned by the American consul for the selection of Padua for its location are preposterous. The consul stated, Padua has a long tradition of tolerance with one of the oldest universities in Europe where Galileo left a significant mark. Padua teaches that we are not supposed to fear violence. So the same thing you could say in Rome, where Giordano Bruno was executed, In reality, as we shall see in a moment, the actual meaning of this 164 feet high memorial resides, and this is the core of my talk, resides much less in its being a tribute to the victims of the 9/11 attack and more in its reflecting the current status of Italian cultural identity. Approaching the memorial, our gaze is drawn first of all to the twisted beam in its left side. The disturbing presence of the twisted beam at the core of this memorial points to a time of grief, of a grief that hasn't healed yet. And this is what makes it very different and powerful. This building, it's not it's not useless in itself. It is really a powerful building, a powerful memorial. It is a ruined monument, so to speak, the disharmonious time of ruins when the future of reconstruction is not in sight. It reminded me, for example, of the torturous paintings of Alberto Burri. Its presence points not to a comforting closure, but more to a present fracture. My belief contradicts what Libeskind has stated in multiple occasions about this work of his. His intention was to show that, quote, the light of freedom shines through his memorial, which celebrates, quote, the eternal affirmation of freedom which he has inscribed at the base of the Statue of Liberty. His memorial is luminous, which is certainly true literally at night when from afar its glow is at once fascinating and inconsequential, as we shall see in a moment. The core of the Italian memorial lies in the twisted steel beam, which is in this particular instance works as a relic. As in the Middle Ages, body parts of deceased Holy Catholic figures were scattered through various religious institutions. The unique nature of this Italian 9/11 memorial becomes even more evident if we compare it to the one installed in the Essex County Eagle Rock Reservation in New Jersey, across the street. I don't know if you go to New Jersey much, but if you dare to go, you'll see that it's really across from the Hudson River. Then inaugurated in 2002 and expanded in 2009, which makes use of the same two key elements present in Padua, an open book and steel beams from the Twin Towers. However, whereas the Italian installation summons a sense of undefined mystery, the New Jersey one is a complex and dynamic mise-en-scène, an actual theatrical representation with multiple characters and whose explicit goal is to both remember the tragedy and celebrate the resilience of the American people and its bright present and future. As this succinct, there is a brochure that accompanies, that explains this, this monument. And he says, this hilltop will forever have special meaning for the thousands who made their way to Essex County Eagle Rock Reservation to watch the shocking events unfolding at the World Trade Center. I took this picture on the 4th of July last year. In visiting this memorial, the spectator experiences a sort of mise en abîme, in the sense that the bronze book opened, we have a book also in Padua, opened to the 2 pages listing the names of the 58 people from Essex County who died on 9/11, is both stage, the present act of remembrance, and auditorium of a past tragedy, because from this very location, people gathered to watch the collapse of the towers. Moreover, unlike the imposing white and blank pages of the book in Padua, the New Jersey bronze volume marking the names of the victims doesn't stand alone. It is characterized by 2 additional elements. On top of the book, a bronze eagle with its wings spread in flight and pointed to Manhattan, which adds an openly patriotic connotation to America's everlasting belief in itself and in the power of its freedom. And second, standing at the center of the open book, the bronze statue of a young girl, Gabriella, holding a teddy bear. She represents, quote, the more than 1,000 children who lost a family member on 9/11. And on the left side, facing Manhattan, the additional quite powerful bronze figure of a young man holding a lantern evokes the desire, quote, to renew our faith in our American way of life. In this memorial, the steel beams recovered from the Twin Towers do not work as relics, but rather as indexes, a la Pierce, of the catastrophe America has victoriously overcome. It is telling that the steel beams are used to communicate the brave and unshakable resilience of all the rescuers, including the search dogs, like this one, signifying the victorious rebirth after the evil events. The statue of a dog stands on a steel beam and chunks of concrete from the fallen buildings. Much more traditional in its conceptualization, Memory and Light in Padua is meant to keep alive the remembrance of a past tragedy, but it also wishes to conjure up a sharp emotional reaction, avoid the intellectual suspension of a trauma. In the 17th century, a very famous intellectual, Emanuele Tesauro, who wrote a huge tome on metaphor, wrote a book called Filosofia Morale, and he would call the experience that we are looking at a sort of brief ecstasy, una breve estasi, that demands to be felt. In his conversation with Jacques Derrida about his Berlin Jewish Museum, the architect Libeskind makes a significant statement about this issue. Quote, "To me, the void is close to the avant-garde, by which I mean Moses. The avant-garde is a people under God without any mediating circumstances, no explanation to as why, and no possibility of relinquishing it. The avant-garde in Libeskind original interpretation is an experience rather than a concept. Granting a spiritual connotation to the installation, the relic recovered from the rubble of the World Trade Center is the only element mentioned in the title." So what I'm about to do now is to read what we have, the panels. As you can see, there is a text in Italian followed by an English translation. So what I'm about to read now are just the English translation when is necessary. When it's more useful, I will also read the Italian because there is a meaning in that. So the English version states, "Structural beam salvaged from the World Trade Center in New York in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001, given from the State Department of the United States to the region of Venice, dedicated on September 11, 2005. I will not give a detailed analysis of these memorials and will only focus on what is relevant for this talk. Let's stay with the written text accompanying the monument. The inspirational words inscribed on the lateral lower panels are centered on two of the U.S. most significant historical periods: the presidency of Abraham Lincoln as the spiritual founder of the nation, but also the first prominent victim in U.S. history, and the 9/11 terrorist attacks. In both cases, the Italian text is followed by an English version. The most baffling facets, here we go. The most baffling facets of the memorial are the two paragraphs revealing the meaning of the two words composing its title, memoria. So now I'm going to read both versions. Cittadini, ero una trave d'acciaio nelle torri gemelle, ma nel Kentucky c'è ancora la povera casa di Abraham Lincoln, 16° presidente degli Stati Uniti. Lottò per l'eliminazione della schiavitù. Pochi giorni prima di essere ucciso da un fanatico, nel suo discorso inaugurale per il secondo mandato aveva detto: «Continuo l'opera iniziata senza odio verso nessuno e carità verso tutti». The second part, luce, so this is memoria, luce, says, ci accompagni la luce operosa del mattino fino a sera, lungo i crinali dei monti, sulla riva del mare. Mario Rigoni Stern. And now I'm going to read the English version. Citizens, I used to be a steel beam in the Twin Towers, but in Kentucky there was. The Italian says there still is. There was. Abraham Lincoln's poorhouse, United States 16th president. He fought for the elimination of slavery a few days before being killed by a fanatic. During his inauguration speech for his second mandate, he stated, I continue the work that has been started without any hate toward anybody and with charity for all. And now we get to light. There was memory, now we get to light. Light. The morning light shall get along with us. So the morning light shall get along with us. Until the night comes on the mountain's crest and on the sea rivers. Mario Rigoni Stern. We'll come back to this. If the first longer and anonymous text centers around U.S. history, the second comes from Mario Rigoni Stern, 1921-2008, a well-known writer from the Veneto region, whose work focuses on the tragic events of World War II. Rigoni Stern, who passed away only 3 years after composing this brief quote, "The Light," was born soon after the end of the Great War, World War I, whose devastating effects were still very visible in the author's land. With his books, the Italian author wished to keep alive the memory of Italy's historical trauma before, during, and after World War II. The cryptic quote from the Paduan Memorial also alludes to another important facet of Rigoni Stern's poetics, his visceral attachment to the Asiago Plateau where he grew up, and more broadly, his fierce defense of nature against all forms of modern degradation. Degradation is, in fact, however, unfortunately, the core of the Paduan Memorial. It is a ruined presence in the Italian landscape, pointing not to the American terrorist attack, but rather to the contemporary state of Italian cultural identity. We will address this crucial point from two different angles: the abandoned condition of this memorial and the problematic texts that accompany it. In 2012, acts of vandalism were reported, as we see in this photo. In 2018, the newspaper Il Mattino di Padova stated that the memorial was in a state of decay, degrado, with trash and syringes everywhere, and its walls had been vandalized with obscene graffiti. It goes without saying that the deterioration of the memorial stems from its perceived irrelevance and isolation from the rest of the city. Again, why was it built in the first place? The second revealing facet is the language used in the memorial. Speaking of the deterioration of Memoria e Luce, this memorial, one can't help but notice the embarrassing grammatical mistakes in the English translation of the title and the two-part short commentary. I'll mention only a few examples. The Italian text says, "Nel Kentucky c'è ancora," whereas, making no real sense, the English version claims that the poorhouse was, so thus it's no more. Similarly, in the quote from the Italian, and I know why, because he had the translator had a problem with ancora, c'è ancora. Similarly, in the quote from the Italian writer Rigoni Stern, the hopeful exclamation, "Ci accompagni la operosa luce," becomes "the morning light shall get along with us." So the author of the translation didn't know how to handle the subjunctive, and he didn't know how to translate operosa, so he just left it out. This embarrassing, and get along, the light, the morning light, the get along, and the sea rivers. I mean, that is just... these embarrassing grammatical errors, along with given from the State Department, so given by and coming from becomes given from, in the very title of the memorial, only amplify that sense of remoteness or even alienation and ruination that accompanies our visit to the Paduan memorial. The only conclusion one can draw is that the Italian memorial to the terrorist attacks sprang less from the perception that the tragedy concerned all of us. This is what people could say, all of us, by us meaning the Western world, and more from the Italian people's self-perception of being part of the vast and powerful American empire. The memorial is paradoxically a transient expression of Italians' national pride. I've used the word transient, or I could use temporary, because such a paradoxical, false self-construction can't be sustained. That is, it can't be turned into a conscious awareness. We Italians have been a colonized people for centuries. Our colonized condition is in our DNA, and had developed a unique sense of identity reflected in our use of the word Stato, which is not a synonym for governo. Stato, it's a kind of a Kafkaesque concept. Stato indicates a vague and hostile entity, like the Spanish government or the French of the Austrian. An hostile entity residing somewhere else, and from which Italians must protect themselves and their families by not paying taxes and all forms of deception. A second dilemma is the presence of an additional semi-foreign entity, the Catholic Church, placed literally in the heart of the country. So there are two states, lo Stato and the Catholic Church. A girl was asked on TV, who is the head of the government? The Pope. And she was not wrong, there are so many laws that couldn't pass because the Vatican, like civil unions in Italy. Italy was the last country in the Western world, after Cyprus and Greece, to pass a very watered-down civil union law. So, speaking of our present conditions, Italians have welcomed the latest colonizer with open arms. Like memoria e luce, the Italian idiom itself is in a state of shameful decay. The daily tsunami of American words and idioms is shocking and deeply disheartening. Today, Italian finds itself unable to express basic concepts, objects, events, experiences. And unlike other Western European languages, flaunts its constantly growing use of English words as a sign of cultural progress. And we could go back to Pasolini and the issue of the dialect and Pasolini's emphasis on the language of expression, the language of communication. But here we're dealing with something much, much more ominous. So a couple of years ago, the Times Literary Supplement had a very embarrassing article, and it was incomplete but was not wrong. Il trend for finglese, which means the fake English, il falso inglese. And the article correctly stated that there was like an avalanche, a constant daily avalanche of American words that Italians love to use in their daily conversation in order to show the words like the other day I heard the news and I thought, did she say cashback? These words need to be felt as foreign, need to be felt as American. And there is pride in this. And they are like infinite. They're just infinite. So when a language has weakened to the point of being seemingly unable, for example, to describe the COVID pandemic, I don't know how language instructors of Italian explain that in Italy you had, and I'm going to speak in Italian now, c'era un lockdown e gli over 60 e non under 60 facevano un booster. So I'm sorry, but this is not laughable. It's not a funny business, because Italian is my native tongue. And as an Italian who has spent most of his life not in Italy, but is an Italian, I find myself deeply disturbed. The scholar Giulia Kristeva wrote a book that was very, very significant many years ago called Strangers to Ourselves. And it dealt with the issue of immigrants coming to a foreign country and the psychological consequences that they had to endure when they were unable to express themselves in their own language. So, what does it mean for Italians to affirm their identity by using American words, by using a language that must remain partially foreign? I really don't know. In an interview on NPR, a German professor of linguistics explained that during the COVID pandemic, the German language had created far too many new words, and certainly some of them would be forgotten. On the contrary, Italian could only resort to the American language to describe its own experience. Although we Italians do not learn English very well, I don't think that we Italians stand out for our fluency in English. We need English words, however, in Italy, Italians living in Italy, to prop up a national idiom that has aged, deteriorated, in ruins, like the Paduan memorial, and thus perceived as irrelevant, like the infinite and annoying ancient ruins, Roman ruins, that constantly show up while the Italian authorities try hard to complete a line of the Roman subway. They can't do it. There is another temple, whatever that is. Why didn't the Italian authorities ask a native speaker of English to check the texts in the memorial, which are simply an embarrassment? It's because its author or authors felt entitled to handle a language that has de facto become part of their own previous mother tongue. Like the notion of Stato, the American language is at once foreign and private and personal. Unlike the Stato, however, it's through the presence of English in Italians' daily conversation that they find some delusional sense of national self. It is an identity founded on oblivion, on the inability to reckon with our past, and the choice of not taking responsibility for our past. This is the essential point that links my brief reflections on the Paduan memorial to the Fosse Ardeatine, which recalls a tragic moment of Italian history. The massacre of the Fosse ardeatine has in fact become incomprehensible, a paradox like Memoria e Luce, because its origins, the fascist era, has never been culturally processed and recognized as a shameful, a criminal time of our own making. This is a central point for a better understanding of the Fosse ardeatine. We Italians we still are Italiani brava gente, victims of the vicious, evil Germans, as popular culture has reiterated ad nauseum. In his latest Netflix show, the Italian cartoonist Zero Calcare makes this point very clear. Why don't we use the word Nazi when speaking of the radical right-wing anti-immigration movement? And he explains it in this clip. It has a British accent. I couldn't find the original version, but on Netflix you'll find it. For those of us who are not native speaker, it's really hard to understand. His dialect is Roman. So here we go.
So then, since the start of this story, I know you've all really been thinking, so why is he saying the word Nazis? Does he still think it's 1945? He's like that granddad who thinks there's a bomb siren going off every time the microwave pings? No, I'll explain it to you methodically. In this country, if you used to say fascist, it was horrible. Now nobody seems to give a shit anymore. They just say,
well, he's a fascist, but he's alright.
It's a bit like saying,
well, he's a celiac, bit of a pain in the bum when you have your tea out, but it's not a big deal.
Nazism, however, is the last bastion still struggling to find space in the market of democracy. Maybe due to the fact that Jewish people are still kind of upset at what they went through during the Holocaust. So basically, if you think that the Axis powers should have won the Second World War, then for me you're a Nazi, end of. I don't give a shit about knowing in which years it was legitimate to beat people up and make them drink casserole, blah, blah, blah.
Okay. So saying fascist in the light of fascism doesn't mean much. It's a kind of cool. Zero Calcare points out, even though the current government is dominated by a party, I Fratelli d'Italia, which is just comical on its own, that has kept in its symbol the three-color flame that represent the neo-fascist party Movimento Sociale. I guess you know some of us are too young to remember the Movimento Sociale. So this is the Movimento Sociale Italiano, the openly neo-fascist party, and this is the Fratelli d'Italia that has kept. This is the main party in the current government. The flame is still there. So the root, the fascist root, has not been eradicated. They're proud of it. More importantly, a pro-fascist sentiment has become accepted as even a source of personal pride. On the channel La Sette, the former mayor of Rome, Alemanno, stated that, like 30% of the Italian people, but more than that, he is not antifascista. Io non sono antifascista. So let's go back to the panel of the Paduan Memorial. Citizens are used to be a steel beam in the Twin Towers. Memory and Light and the Fosse ardeatine make use of a similar rhetorical device in their introductory panels. The Fosse ardeatine mausoleum, where the remains of 335 Roman citizens, including a 16-year-old boy, murdered by the German army on March 24, 1944, rest above ground in a simple hollow concrete structure close to the site of the massacre. After the massacre in Rome, which was discovered after the liberation on June 4th, 1944, the Germans blew up the Pozzolana quarries in which the corpses piled up in order to conceal the carnage. The competition for the monument was announced in 1944, only 3 months after the liberation of Rome and the discovery of the site of the massacre. The Fosse ardeatine by Mario Fiorentino and others were, quote, meant to commemorate not only the victims of the massacre, but all victims of the war of liberation. Before reaching the tombs, in a panel, the victims themselves, as the steel beam in Padua, as Christ-like figures address the visitors, remind them of their violent death, and express the wish that their sacrifice may bring about peace in Italy and in the world. Here, I read my translation, here victims of an appalling massacre, we were slaughtered. From our sacrifice may a homeland country arise, and a long-lasting peace among men. The victims' remains lie in the mausoleum that was inaugurated in 1949, 5 years after the massacre. Before being buried in the mausoleum, the bodies of the victims were hidden in the rubble resulting from the explosion. The documentary Giorni di Gloria, Days of Glory, I will see in a moment, released in 1945 along with Roma Città Aperta, and resulted from the collaboration of Giuseppe De Santis, Marcello Pagliero, Luchino Visconti, and Mario Serandrei, shows the disturbing conditions of the cave with the human remains. This is a significant difference between the memorial, the 9/11 memorial here in New York City, the Paduan memorial, and the Fosse ardeatine. When you visit the 9/11 memorial here in New York, you can see no trace of the actual remains. Everything has been kind of cleaned up. There is a corner where you find the very disturbing image of that lady, the poor lady, that even though she's falling down to her death, she pushed down her skirt in a sense of, modesty and reservation. Here, instead of the Fosse ardeatine, you see in a moment the human remains that were found after the bomb are visible. And you'll see in a moment.
Gli italiani non dimenticheranno i caduti del 24 marzo. Uccisi nel buio delle fosse ardeatine, i 320 martiri furono le vittime di un ingiustificabile atto di rappresaglia e di terrorismo. Il loro commosso ricordo si unisce a quello delle tante vittime del Moloch tedesco. Fosse ardeatine, Mauthausen, Majdanek, Buchenwald. In Italia, in Europa, ovunque, ogni città, ogni paese ha avuto i suoi campi della morte. Sanguinose tappe per la riconquista della libertà.
Okay. So, like the mausoleum in New York, the Fosse ardeatine invite a visitor to embark on a path of spiritual awakening. In New York, we descend into the bowels of the towers where the remains of the savage objects are exposed to our silent reflection. In a like manner, in the Fosse ardeatine, we walk through a dark tunnel that may recall the cave of the Cumaean Sibyl after reaching the tombs of the victims, some of them still unknown, ignoto. What makes the Fosse ardeatine unique is that the tragic event, destined to oblivion despite its austere mausoleum, is implicitly evoked in the unforgettable visual narrative Rossellini's Rome Open City, something that no film on 9/11 has been able to achieve. 9/11 remains a scandal that, despite the innumerable monuments all over the world, is still an impossible, unfathomable occurrence. Hollywood has been so far unable to turn the chaos of 9/11 into a self-aggrandizing narrative. The modest impact of films such as United 93 or Extremely Loud and Extremely Close can't compare to Rossellini's Roma città aperta. One possible reason is that, unlike the fight against the Nazi regime, the war on terror, as George W. Bush called it, is never ending. And more importantly, unlike the experience of World War II in Europe, the terrorist attack didn't coincide with the radical cultural and political turning point in American identity. A personal or national trauma is recognized and fully processed when it becomes narratable, or better yet, when its history becomes mythology. However, it is important to recall that Rossellini's work makes no explicit reference to the Fosse ardeatine, because the Fosse ardeatine and the massacre resulted from an attack of the partigiani, and so there was a debate whether, the partigiani, the resistance, was responsible indirectly for the Fosse ardeatine. So Rossellini makes no explicit reference, even though everybody knows what we're talking about. And the film contains allusions to the event, such as the priest executed at the end of the film. So, I grew up with the Roma città aperta and documentaries about the Nazis' occupation of Rome. I was a little kid in the late 60s, and my aunt, the intellectual of the family, used to take me to these, a small movie theaters where we watched documentaries about the war, about the Nazi occupation, and I developed a terror, I had nightmares with Nazis and the German language, that still lingers in my mind. And so when I saw the scene that you know very well, of Anna Magnani running after the truck, with her lover that's going to his execution and she's murdered, I was always very moved by this scene. But now, I'm not sure what I'm watching. I'm not totally sure what the meaning is of this scene, because it seems to reiterate something that we should overcome. The idea that we are always victims, that Italians are victims, that there were all evil presences, that we were not responsible, and so on and so forth. There is no real film comparable to Roma città aperta that narrates the violence of Mussolini. Most of the times is sarcasm, like Fellini, Amarcord, but the violence, the brutality of the fascists is not part of our history. So let's watch together now but this important scene from Roma città aperta. And then I'd like to hear from you how you react to this now, because it's a very well-known scene.
Francesco!
stop here. Thank you very much.
You have a microphone for the question or I would just ask a clarifying question, I guess. And thank you for this really incisive and probing talk, Armando. Thinking about the place of Italy in the orbit of these two empires, whose sort of again nefariousness is considered relative, right? The American vis-a-vis the Nazi, and the Italian sort of role in that, or place in that orbit. With regard to the two, so just starting with regard to the two monuments, well, the first thing I would say is before my question is that it seemed to me that Rossellini's, why does that narrative happen? I mean, it seems part and parcel of this need, right, for a partisan movement, if Italy is going to survive fascism psychologically and ideologically, that there had to be a myth of internal liberation rather than the American, liberation, right? That there had to be a partisan movement which was itself the real kind of engine of Italy's liberation rather than an external salvation, right? And so, and that coalition, of course, is also what, at least until 1948, allowed, the sort of Marxist and even Catholic entities to sort of share power, right? But I'm interested in hearing how you might sort of problematize that narrative. With regard to the two monuments and your linking of them, maybe you could just clarify the extent to which, I mean, I think you're absolutely right about the kind of the almost sort of weird fetishistic presence of that splinter, like almost like a kind of, very much like a religious sort of reliquia. It's almost sort of perverse in a sense, especially as juxtaposed with what is very kind of sort of corporate, almost soulless architecture of that monument, which doesn't really seem to have, which evokes maybe the two towers in its shape, but doesn't have any other sort of explicit reference either to the event or to any sort of contextualization. And I also agree, as you were starting out the talk, I thought to myself, like, but why is this in Padua to begin with? And as you very much kind of underscored, it's completely, random in a sense. But so how would you, if you could sort of summarize you're constellating these two monuments and what you would kind of challenge about them respectively, how would you sort of put that? That's what I'm trying to kind of synthesize in my head.
Oh, I don't need. Yeah, no, your question is totally reasonable, and my first answer is that my experience, okay, of these two moments, and first of all, obviously the monument in Padua doesn't contain, the remains of any victims, unlike it's in pro loco, the Fosse ardeatine. But it seemed to me that the two sort of stood for two major moments of Italian history. So like World War II, the end of World War II, and then this new sad phase, so to speak, of Italian identity, that is the turning point. In both cases, it's a kind of a turning point. So with the Paduan Memorial, when I was a kid in second grade, third grade, in scuola elementari, they took us to the Fosse ardeatine. And I remember that I was pretty shocked because I was a little kid. Now they don't do it anymore. So that's just one thing. I asked my nieces; they don't take kids out to the Fosse ardeatine. But it seemed to me that in both cases there was a display of some kind of modern Italian identity, and so paradoxically, this Paduan thing that Libeskind describes as fitting well in the medieval landscape, it doesn't fit there. It signified for me really like this kind of nonsensical, sort of absurd moment in which we live right now. And so after visiting and seeing this monument by chance, totally by chance, I then thought back about the Fosse ardeatine and the idea of what is fascism, what is really like, not, academics, not professors in fancy universities, but what do people really think about fascism? They have no clue. So my thought was, so what does it mean to go to the Fosse ardeatine? What is that you're doing? If you take, like school to the Fosse ardeatine, you'll teach them that they have to feel, sorrowful and da-da-da-da-da-da. But what do you really learn about history? And so it's similarly here, they built this thing in the middle of nowhere in Padua in honor of the victims who died in New York City. And then they forgot it. They just left it there. So, just spent this money. They didn't even check. I mean, the translation is horrifying, and that, sort of led me to this kind of reflection about the very disturbing condition, because the culture and the language are together. They come together. So, again, at a very personal level, I have to say that I do not like reading Italian news or watching TV news because it's just, I mean, the kind of the tsunami of American words constantly, it is horrifying. And that tells me one important thing. I had an encounter. I met a friend who, in all these games of reflections and projections, didn't want to use the word upgrade because I am l'americano. And so he didn't want to use English because he thought that he would mispronounce a word and I would judge him. So he was trying to say that he wanted to upgrade his ticket from economy to economy plus or whatever that was. But he couldn't find the Italian word. It couldn't. I don't think I answered your question.
Oh, it's okay. I mean, I think it's interesting because some Americans might say, well, but then, America is also, it's interesting because we're challenged in other non-technical ways when I think in America, when we want to, things related to music and culture and even sex happen in Italian and Latin, right? From, the dolce vita to in flagrante delicto to you name it. It's almost like we're sort of, we're there. It's by no means the same, and it's not subtended by the same ideological and obviously very clearly economic reasons. That I think you're right. Your basic reading of the monument that it's a kind of cultural discursive reinscription of Italian identity within this larger American empire, which disturbingly is now very much on display in the wake of what's going on in the Middle East and various voices coming out of Italy that want very much to claim that this is a clash between the Occidente, of which Italy is part and a sympathizer, and other forces, right? So I think you're absolutely right that there is this it's almost a kind of gesture more than an actual will to commemorate. It's also an attempt to kind of reinscribe Italy as a kind of, not necessarily a client state, but some sort of vassal of this American empire, paying obeisance to its pain as if it were Italy's own, in a sense. Right?
Yeah, the difference is that we have always been colonized. So, but we didn't speak French. We didn't learn German. You know what I mean? We had the Spaniards for a long time. But now in this situation, what you said, the flagrante delitto, la dolce vita, and so on and so forth, you could say also barista, when you go to Starbucks. Yeah, okay. Those are concepts that refer to something that is new. Okay. So it's not a server, it's not a waiter, it's someone that is making coffee for you, and also he had this kind of flavor of, Italian, whatever that is, la dolce vita and this and that. But here, when you can't use words to describe the pandemic, we are dealing with a different story.
Or when there are words that exist. I have a friend who works for the RAI, and I remember his frustration that his colleagues kept calling it a trailer, and he was like, "We have a word for that, the sigla.
Of course.
We have a
Of
word.
course.
Why do you keep calling it?"
Of course, of course, of course.
But whereas the French have because of the history of the academy.
Yes.
A real kind of almost, policing in a sense of these violations.
Yes, yes.
Italy's defenses are, and you could say that sort of back to kind of Marshall Plan, back even earlier to the Zio d'America, right? This kind of sympathy between, the big brother America that is, there's not a certain sense of protection culturally.
But I think that it's important, that they, they should become aware to the point of anger, to the point of becoming really furious and enraged about this. And this is very important. So it's not, because at this point, really, I don't know what language I'm speaking. I'm holding on to a kind of old-fashioned 19th century Italian. When I talk on the phone with people, they're using these words, I'm watching a fiction. Guardo una fiction.
Well, one sort of, not necessarily cynical, but as you know very well from our sort of mutual work on Pasolini, that Pasolini's argument was that the real fascism was the culture of late capitalism, and whereas fascism wanted to be a totalizing culture to immerse people in an entirely new language, right? They reset the calendar to 1922. I mean, what could be, since the French Revolution, a more obvious attempt at a wholesale ideological revolution than even saying that time begins with the March on Rome, right? And yet, Pasolini argued, those attempts were half-hearted. They failed. Indoctrination into fascist ideology and subjectivity was only ever half-assed. It didn't really work. Whereas the culture of consumerism, which necessarily emerged, obviously, from America, was totalizing in a way that was not even remotely the same under fascism. And obviously the engine of that totalization is language, as Pasolini...
You're completely right. So, Pasolini didn't envision this final step.
Yeah, right.
He didn't see that.
Yeah.
He looked at the end of the death of the dialects and the language the flat language of television, but he didn't see this coming.
Yeah, he only had the TV. The internet was not even.
It didn't. It was not a concept.
I often think if he called the TV the engine of cultural genocide, what would he have thought of the internet, right? So anyway. Further questions, comments? Yes.
In 2006, I was in an NEH study group with Frank Snowden, who's a historian from Yale, and it was on Italian fascism. And I went one night to a friend's house, and she had boys who were in high school, and I said, according to Professor Snowden, fascism has never really been dealt with by Italians. We've never, there were no Nuremberg trials. We never came, And the two boys who are in high school said, "Are you kidding? That's all we hear about in school. Like they shove it down our throats, fascist, fascist, fascist." And I just wonder what you think about that, because I thought it was so interesting that here were these two boys in high school saying, "Oh, we don't want to hear about it anymore." And, okay, Frank Snowden is an American, obviously, but he studied really agrarian fascism. But anyway, I just thought it was fascinating, and I wonder what you think.
Well, based on what Zero Calcare here says, and that this Netflix came out just like a few months ago. So I think that this is pretty eloquent. I don't know if those two kids, maybe, I don't know. I mean, you can't obviously, generalize, but based on what this guy said, and also the politicians, when you have the mayor of Rome saying, "I'm not anti-fascist," and
just two quick observations.
yes,
One is that probably a more effective way of getting young boys to pay attention to ideas like fascism would be to show them Rossellini and Magnani. I think it's pretty well, the brilliance of that film and of her performance sum up very well what would interest boys of that age and get their attention about what the implications of it might be. And the other thing was just on a different tangent from your remarks, and that is that I thought it was very interesting in terms of the memorials that you showed us, that 4 or 5 of the most important post-World War II memorials, like Eisenmann's in Berlin and Lebeskin's attached to the Jewish Museum in Berlin, and the Argentine disappeared
yes,
memorial, and Arad's 9/11 memorial on a different topic. All of them eschew the use of language. Only they all insist that structure and experience will speak to memory effectively. And it's something that I think it's difficult to grasp, because when you go to see these memorials and you reflect upon them, it's really true that what you find there is what you bring with you.
yeah.
Yes.
The New York Memorial, 9/11 Memorial, does, I think, a very good job in explaining the historical evolution of, the extremist, Islam. I thought that part, the historical part, was, well done. I've been there more than once. I've seen it very well. Showing the Rossellini film, there is a caveat there. There are no real fascists in the film. There are the evil Nazis. So there are the Germans. Where is the fascist? And so, when you go through the major films made in Italy, where you have, Mussolini, or other major figures, are often satire. So, it's not really, it was not that bad. You know what I mean? They were not that bad. In Amarcord, in Fellini's Amarcord, what you see is that a guy that gets diarrhea, because he didn't want to kind of speak up and reveal the names of, his friends who were anti-fascist. So essentially, there was no harsh brutality. Fascism was okay. It was not too bad. My mother, well, anyway, the idea was that Mussolini was fine. He just made a mistake that he went with Hitler. This is what they said.
And it really did. That also enabled that myth of that fascism was okay. Something like 39 of 40 prefects under fascism in the 40s remained prefects after the war, and there are fascist laws still on the books. I mean, if the Nazi purges, denazification was half-hearted in part because they needed allies to fight the Cold War in Germany and Austria. The epurazioni, or the sort of de-fascistization in Italy, was absolutely pathetic, and I think that speaks to this notion that even culturally there was, and part of it relates to, again, that notion that Italians could and did wrest back from fascism that which the German populace couldn't, because they were so browbeaten, right? And so there's this notion that that a lot more people ended up being anti-fascist than probably actually were.
One thing that I mentioned, I didn't mention in that article from the Times literary supplement. The author at the end mentions the use of dialects. So she claims that the younger generations are striking back by going back to dialects. I don't really buy into it, but that would be another way of going back to Pasolini, the idea, the importance of the dialect, and how the dialect can enrich the national idiom, But again, just to make sure, Pasolini, the most important European intellectual in a certain way, his obsession was language. He was a poet, and everything had to do with language, the language of expression, language of communication. So, if I sounded obsessed with this idea of language, it's not only because I studied Pasolini, but because it's a real problem. It's not the the exaggeration of someone who has to do with academia. It's really a very, very serious problem, and has to do really with this feeling that you perceive in talking with Italians living in Italy, that they really flaunt their lack of a national language and therefore identity. I went to my nieces took me to a Christmas concert. There was not one Italian song. I mean, in Rome, the super Catholic city in the universe, there was not one Italian song.
I'm sorry, I must have missed it. Why was Padua? I've never been there, so I'm intrigued with all of it. I have a lot.
You haven't missed anything.
It was completely random.
What did the architect choose?
I'm sorry, what did you say?
There's water right down there.
Did Lipskind himself choose Padua for his monument?
I have no idea. Grazie.
Isn't that important?
It is important, but the reasons they gave, they write about, they're ridiculous. The Padua is this beacon of freedom.
And he didn't care as long as he would have.
I mean, they got it there, and then, I wonder, when they went there for the inauguration, did they read what was written there? So no one gave a, you know what I mean?
Please join me in thanking